The morning I got fined for warming up my truck, I knew exactly how it was going to go. I'd seen Kathy Radcliffe's porch light flick on through my rearview mirror at 5:47 in the morning, which meant she was already awake, already watching, already composing whatever righteous complaint she was about to slap together before the sun even bothered to show up. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known because she'd never once in 3 years asked me a single genuine question about my life, was that warming up that truck was the difference between this entire community getting out in the morning and sitting stranded behind a wall of snow until the county got around to caring about us. Which, based on past experience, was somewhere around never. Let me back up a little because this story has a beginning, and the beginning matters. I'm Alex Lambert. I moved into Pineridge Hollow about 4 years ago, right before winter hit. The community is one of those tucked-away neighborhoods that looks gorgeous on a real estate listing and looks slightly terrifying on a weather map. We're nestled between two ridgelines about 12 miles outside of town, and the only road connecting us to the rest of civilization is a single-lane access road called Timber Creek Drive. It winds down the hillside for about half a mile before it meets the county road at the bottom. The county plows the county road. Nobody plows Timber Creek Drive unless someone in the neighborhood does it. When I bought my house, the previous owner mentioned this like it was a fun quirk. "Oh yeah, one of the neighbors plows it," he said, waving his hand like it was the most casual thing in the world. No big deal. No big deal turned out to be a very big deal indeed, because the neighbor who had been plowing it before me moved away the spring after I arrived. Just packed up, sold his house and left, taking his plow rig with him. I found out about this in October, when a guy named Dennis who lives 3 doors down knocked on my door looking a little pale and explained that we had a problem. Dennis is a good guy. He's a retired electrician, probably in his late 60s, has a golden retriever named Biscuit who is basically the mascot of the whole street. Dennis explained that without someone plowing Timber Creek Drive, the neighborhood would be completely cut off anytime we got more than about 3 inches of snow. The HOA, he said, did not have a contract with any plow service. The HOA board, he explained carefully, had been meaning to figure that out for 2 years. They had not figured it out. I happened to own a full-size pickup with a front-mounted plow blade. I'd used it at my previous place out in the country. It was just something I had, the way some people have a nice grill or a kayak they use twice a year. I told Dennis I could handle it. He looked like I'd told him I was going to cure a disease. He thanked me about 8 times and brought me a casserole the next week. We worked out a pretty simple arrangement. I'd plow Timber Creek Drive whenever we got enough accumulation to matter, plus I'd clear the turnaround circle at the top and keep the main internal loop passable. In exchange, the HOA, and I use that term loosely because the board was already a bit of a mess, would cover my cost of fuel and basic maintenance for the plow equipment. It was a handshake deal mostly, but I got it in a short written agreement that the board president at the time, a reasonable man named Gary, signed off on. Gary moved away the following summer, which was deeply unfortunate timing. Because the summer Gary left was the summer Kathy Radcliffe got elected to the board, and when I say elected, I mean she essentially ran the meeting until everyone else was too exhausted to argue. She brought printed ballots to a meeting that had never used printed ballots before. She cited bylaw sections nobody had read. She wore a blazer. Nobody else wore a blazer. Kathy Radcliffe became HOA president with a kind of efficiency that would have been impressive if it had been applied to literally anything useful. Within 3 months, she'd issued fines for holiday lights left up past January 6th, unapproved garden decorations. A guy had a ceramic frog. She fined him $40 for it, and something she called landscaping inconsistency, which she'd apparently invented on the spot and had no basis in the actual HOA documents. But she sent the letters anyway, on official-looking stationery she'd apparently designed herself, and a lot of people just paid them because the whole thing felt too exhausting to fight. I watched all of this with a certain wariness. I was friendly with my neighbors. I kept my property neat. I didn't have any ceramic frogs or anything she could reasonably object to. I plowed the road every time it snowed. I kept my head down. For about 8 months, Kathy and I had a cold, professional non-relationship where we nodded at each other near the mailboxes and said nothing of substance. Then January hit. And January hit hard. We'd already had 2 decent snowfalls by Christmas, and I'd plowed after both without a word from anyone except gratitude. Then the new year rolled in and the weather systems just started stacking up one after another. We got 8 inches in the first week of January. I plowed. We got 4 more days later. I plowed. The temperatures dropped into the single digits and stayed there, which meant the snow that didn't get cleared was turning into ice. The roads inside the neighborhood were manageable because I kept them up, but Timber Creek Drive was a serious piece of work every single morning. The issue with Timber Creek Drive in the deep cold is that even after you plow it, the temperature overnight will freeze whatever slush got left on the surface into something resembling a luge track. Which means when I went out to plow, I needed the truck fully warmed up. Not slightly warm, fully warm. The plow hydraulics on my setup run off the engine, and in temperatures below 10 degrees, those hydraulics get sluggish in a way that makes the blade respond slowly and unpredictably. I'd learned this the hard way 2 winters ago at my old place when a slow blade caught me off guard on a slope, and I'd had to back down a hill at 2 in the morning praying the whole rig didn't slide sideways into a ditch. Never again. Cold morning meant the truck ran for at least 15 minutes before I put it in gear. So every morning when we were expecting snow or freezing conditions, I'd go out around 5:30 or 5:45, start the truck, let it idle in my driveway, and use the time to check weather radar, check road conditions on my phone, grab coffee, get my gear sorted. By 6, the truck was warm, the hydraulics were loose, and I was on Timber Creek Drive before anyone else in the neighborhood was even thinking about breakfast. This had been my routine for a full winter and a half. Nobody had ever said a word about it, until Kathy Radcliffe decided January was a good month to expand her empire. The fine notice came on a Tuesday. I found it tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck when I came back from plowing, which I thought was a particularly bold choice, since the truck was literally still warm from doing the thing that keeps everyone in this neighborhood from being marooned. The notice was on Kathy's official-looking stationery. It cited HOA Rule 7.4, which I pulled out my copy of the HOA documents to look up immediately, and which stated that residents were not permitted to idle vehicles for extended periods in driveways between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., due to noise and exhaust concerns. The fine was $75, with a note that repeated violations would double the penalty. I stood in my driveway in the cold, holding this piece of paper, and I did something I almost never do before coffee. I laughed. I genuinely, deeply laughed, because the audacity was so spectacular that it kind of looped all the way around to being funny. This woman, who had benefited from my unpaid except for fuel labor every single time it snowed, who would have been sitting in a snow-locked neighborhood without me, had watched me warm up the truck I used to plow her road and decided to fine me $75 for it. My laughter lasted about 45 seconds. Then I went inside, made my coffee, and started thinking. Here's the thing about Kathy Radcliffe that she never seemed to understand about herself. She was very good at projecting authority, but she was not actually very good at thinking things through. She saw the truck idling in the driveway at dawn, and she saw a rule violation, and she went straight to the fine notice without stopping to ask herself what might happen next. She didn't consider the consequences because consequences, in her worldview, were things that happened to other people. I decided I wasn't going to respond immediately. I wanted her to think the fine was having its intended effect. I wanted her to feel like she'd won this particular round because people like Kathy Radcliffe get sloppy when they think they're winning. I paid the fine. Yes, I paid it. Not because I thought it was valid, but because paying it kept her calm and confident while I set up the rest of my plan. I know that sounds odd, but stay with me. That same week, I did a few things. First, I dug out my copy of the written agreement I'd made with Gary 2 years earlier, the one where the HOA agreed to cover my fuel and maintenance costs in exchange for my plowing services. I photographed every page. Then I did something I should probably have done sooner. I looked up the actual language of the HOA agreement in detail, not just the rules that Kathy had been citing. The whole thing, including the sections about board authority, the process for levying fines, and the section. And this was the important one about essential services and community agreements. I also made a phone call to a neighbor named Sandra, who lives at the far end of the loop, and who I knew had been keeping notes on every fine Kathy had issued, because Sandra is meticulous and doesn't trust people who wear blazers to HOA meetings. Sandra confirmed that she had documentation of 11 fines issued in the past 4 months, at least 6 of which were for violations that either didn't exist in the actual HOA documents or had been issued without the required written warning that the bylaws mandated before a fine could be levied. This was important information. Then I called Dennis. Dennis and I had a good long conversation over the phone about plow schedules, road conditions, and the general state of Timber Creek Drive. I asked him very casually how he thought the neighborhood would do if, say, someone were unable to plow for a stretch of time. Dennis was quiet for a second. Then he said very carefully, "Alex, that road iced over so bad in 2019 that 3 cars couldn't make it up the slope, and we had a woman in labor who had to wait for a 4-wheel drive neighbor to get her out." He paused. "That was before you moved in." I told him I appreciated the context. He told me he appreciated me. I was not, to be clear, planning to hold the neighborhood hostage. That's not who I am. I plow that road because people need it plowed and I'm able to do it. The idea of letting people get stranded didn't sit right with me, and it never would. But I also wasn't going to keep getting fined for the exact thing that made the road safe to drive. The weather that January was relentless. We got another 6 inches the Wednesday after I got my fine notice, and I was out at 5:30 in the morning, truck running, warming up in the driveway, plow blade gleaming in my headlights like it always did. And like clockwork at 5:48, Kathy Radcliffe's porch light came on. I could see it from my truck window, that little yellow rectangle in the dark. She was watching. She was definitely composing another fine notice in her head. This time, though, I had my phone mounted on my dash and I was recording. Front-facing camera running the whole time. I also had my neighbor across the street, a younger guy named Marco who worked early shifts and who I'd had a brief conversation with the night before, running a camera from his porch. He'd been happy to do it. Kathy had fined him $60 for a basketball hoop that had been in his driveway for 11 years before she moved into the neighborhood. I let the truck warm up its full 15 minutes. Then I drove to Timber Creek Drive and plowed it clean, top to bottom, 3 full passes, pushed all the snow to the sides, cleared the drainage ditches at the bottom so water wouldn't refreeze across the road surface. It was good work. It took me about 45 minutes, and by the time I pulled back into my driveway, the sky was just starting to lighten up at the edges. I went inside. I made coffee. I waited. The fine notice appeared under my wiper sometime around 8 that morning. Same stationery. Same Rule 7.4 citation. This time the fine was $150 because she'd noted it as a second offense. There was a handwritten addition at the bottom that said, and I am quoting directly, "Please be advised that further violations may result in escalated action, including but not limited to referral to the HOA's legal counsel." This was both a threat and somewhat hilarious because, as far as I knew, the HOA did not actually have legal counsel on retainer. Kathy had apparently decided to imply otherwise. This is when things started moving quickly. I did not pay the second fine. Instead, I wrote a letter. I wrote it calmly and carefully, and I kept every single copy. The letter explained, in polite but unambiguous terms, the following: that I was the sole provider of snow removal services for Timber Creek Drive and the neighborhood loop roads, that this service was provided under a written agreement with the HOA signed by the previous board president, that the vehicle I had been idling in my driveway was the vehicle used to provide this service, that the idling was a necessary operational requirement due to cold weather hydraulic concerns, and that Rule 7.4 contained an explicit carve-out in subsection C, which Kathy had apparently not read, exempting vehicles being used in the provision of essential maintenance services to the community from the idling restriction. I had found subsection C during my detailed review of the HOA documents the week before. It was 2 sentences, a little buried, easy to miss if you were just skimming for ammunition. It said essentially that vehicles operated in direct support of community maintenance, landscaping, or infrastructure services were exempt from the idling and noise restrictions during operating hours. My truck was my plow vehicle. Plowing was community maintenance. Case closed. I sent the letter certified mail to each of the 3 HOA board members. Kathy, a guy named Phil who mostly went along with whatever she said, and an older woman named Bev who had been on the board before Kathy arrived, and who I had a hunch had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Bev called me the next morning. She was very calm on the phone. She said she'd read my letter. She'd gone back and looked at the HOA documents, and she agreed with my reading of the exemption. She also said, and her voice had a certain quiet edge to it, that she had some concerns about the way fines had been issued over the past several months that she'd been waiting for an appropriate time to raise. My letter, she said, seemed like an appropriate time. I liked Bev considerably more after that call. Now, here's where it gets good. Because around this point, Kathy decided that the best move was to escalate. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, sent out notice to all residents, and framed it as a meeting about community standards and compliance issues. She did not mention in the notice that she was specifically trying to address my situation. She probably expected to control the narrative in the room. What she did not account for was that Dennis talked to Sandra. Sandra talked to Marco. Marco talked to everyone on the back half of the loop. And by the time the meeting happened, a Thursday evening, in the community center, which was really just a converted garage at the end of the main road, about 32 of the community's 41 households were represented. Some people who hadn't come to an HOA meeting in years were there. People were in folding chairs, on the little bleacher bench along one wall, standing near the back. It was the best attended HOA meeting in the history of Pineridge Hollow, and I suspect it might remain so. Kathy walked in, and I could see on her face the exact moment she realized this was not the meeting she'd planned. She'd expected maybe 12 people, the usual small crowd, mostly people she could talk over. Instead, she walked into a room that was at capacity and buzzing with the kind of energy that comes from neighbors who have a lot of stored-up things to say. She started the meeting with the usual procedural things: roll call, previous minutes, all of that. Then she moved to what she called new business, and she framed it as a discussion of Rule 7.4 compliance, and she started talking about the importance of community standards and how the rules exist to protect everyone's quality of life. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew exactly what she was talking about. I let her finish. Then I raised my hand. Kathy acknowledged me with the particular smile of someone who thinks they've already won. I stood up, and I kept my voice completely even. I said I appreciated the board's attention to community standards and that I wanted to make sure everyone in the room had the full context for the specific situation being discussed. I then explained concisely what I did every morning: the plowing schedule, the hydraulic requirements, the temperature considerations. I explained that the road they'd all driven in on that evening, the road that every single person in that room used every single day to get to work, to get groceries, to get their kids to school, was serviceable because I went out before sunrise and cleared it. In the past week alone, I said, I'd plowed it 3 times. You could feel the temperature in the room shift in a way that had nothing to do with the actual cold outside. Then I pulled out my copy of the HOA agreement. I read Rule 7.4 in full, including subsection C. I read the written service agreement I'd made with Gary. I passed copies around because I'd made 35 copies ahead of time, one for every household plus a few extras. Then I read the text of both fine notices, and I explained clearly that both fines had been issued in violation of the very bylaw they claimed to enforce, because subsection C explicitly exempted my vehicle. Sandra stood up next. She'd been waiting. She walked to the front of the room with a folder that was, I'm not kidding, about an inch thick, and she laid out, fine by fine, a detailed account of 11 violations that had been levied by Kathy over the past 4 months. She showed which ones lacked the required prior written warning. She showed which ones cited rules that didn't actually exist in the current HOA documents. She showed the dates, the amounts, the affected households. Some of those households were represented in the room. People were nodding. A few people were angry. Then Marco played the videos. He connected his phone to the little projector the community center used for movie nights, and he played his footage from the porch camera showing me warming up my truck in my driveway while the road was still dark and snow-covered, then the truck leaving for Timber Creek Drive. He played the footage of me coming back after plowing. He played it for both mornings in question. You could see, in the footage from the second morning, Kathy's porch light come on at 5:48. Kathy was still in her chair at the board table, but she'd stopped smiling. Phil, who genuinely had the look of a man who had been gradually realizing he'd signed his name to several things he perhaps shouldn't have, quietly slid his copy of Sandra's documentation folder further along the table so he could read it better. Bev spoke then. She did it with the composure of someone who had been holding this moment carefully and was now ready to set it down. She said, formally and for the record, that as a sitting board member she was making a motion to void both of the fines issued to my property, on the grounds that they had been issued in error, and in conflict with subsection C of Rule 7.4. She also made a motion to review all fines issued in the previous 6 months against the actual text of the HOA documents, with any improperly issued fines to be refunded. Phil seconded the motion, possibly because he had read enough of Sandra's folder by then to be genuinely scared. The motions carried. Kathy, to her credit or perhaps just to her tactical instinct, tried to reframe this as a positive review process, a demonstration of the board's commitment to accuracy. Several people in the room were not buying this. A woman named Patricia, who'd been fined $40 for a ceramic frog, and whose frog was still in her garden where it belonged, said quite clearly that she thought the board president should be held accountable for issuing fines without following proper procedure, and that she wanted to understand what accountability looked like in practice. This was a very good question. The HOA bylaws, as it turned out, and I had looked this up, contained a provision allowing for a special recall vote on any board officer if a petition was signed by 30% of households in the community. 30% of 41 households was about 13 signatures. Sandra had a petition ready before the end of the meeting. She got 26 signatures in the room that night alone. Here's where the story takes a turn that even I hadn't fully anticipated, because I'd assumed we were dealing with overreach and bad judgment, which is annoying but not criminal. It was Bev who brought the other thing to my attention, and she did it quietly after the meeting ended, when most people had cleared out, and it was just her and me and Dennis and Sandra standing in the community center while folding chairs got stacked. Bev told me she'd been going through the HOA financial records. She said this carefully, The way you say something when you're not sure how the person you're saying it to is going to react. She'd been going through them because the fine revenue had been going somewhere, and she'd wanted to understand where. The HOA had a general fund, a maintenance account, and an emergency reserve. The fine money, by the bylaws, was supposed to go into the general fund, which was used for things like common area maintenance and the community center. Bev said that, when she looked at the general fund statements, the deposits from fine revenue over the past 4 months didn't match the total she'd calculated from her own records of fines issued. Sandra looked at her folder. She said the fines she'd documented totaled over $1,900. Bev said the general fund showed deposits from fines totaling just over $600. Nobody in that remaining group said anything for a second or two. Sandra said, very quietly, "Where did the other $1,300 go?" Bev said she didn't know, but that she had formally requested the full financial records from Kathy as the board secretary and had not received them. I said I thought we should call someone. Bev agreed. She'd already looked into it enough to know that misappropriation of HOA funds was not just an internal governance issue. It was a legal one. She'd already printed out a few pages of relevant information about HOA financial fraud statutes in our state. The police were called the following Monday morning, not by me, but by Bev, in her capacity as a sitting board member, after she submitted a formal written request for the financial documents and received back from Kathy a response claiming that the records were being reorganized and would be available soon. The reorganizing answer apparently was not convincing to anyone, least of all Bev, who submitted what she had to the local police department's non-emergency line along with her calculations of the discrepancy. I want to be clear, I didn't go looking for this. I went looking for vindication on a $75 fine for warming up my truck. The financial fraud piece was Bev's territory, Bev's discovery, Bev's documentation. I helped where I could by providing my own records of the service agreement and the fuel reimbursements, since those had also been running through the HOA account and could be cross-referenced. The investigation took about 6 weeks. During that time, 2 things happened in the neighborhood. First, the recall petition got enough signatures. It ended up at 31 households, and a special recall vote was scheduled. Second, the snow kept coming. We got another big storm in late January, a real one, 11 inches overnight with another 2 or 3 on top of it the next morning. I was out at 5:15 that day, truck running, steam curling up from the tailpipe into the black winter sky, warming up for a solid 20 minutes because it was 8 degrees, and I wasn't taking any chances. Nobody from the HOA said a single word about it. Actually, what happened was Dennis came out with 2 travel mugs of coffee while I was doing my pre-plow checks, handed me one through the window and said, "Drive safe out there." It was the nicest moment of that whole winter. I plowed Timber Creek Drive 3 times that day. The first pass at 6 in the morning, a cleanup pass around noon when the storm started winding down, and a final saltansond run in the late afternoon to deal with the refreezing situation. Every car that left the neighborhood that day made it out. A delivery truck that came in around 2 in the afternoon made it up the hill without spinning out. Nobody was stuck. Nobody was stranded. The road was exactly what it needed to be. The recall vote happened on a Saturday in early February. It was well attended, because by this point people in the neighborhood had a lot of feelings and opinions about things. The vote to recall Kathy from the board presidency passed by a margin of 33 to 4. I don't know who the 4 were, and I've decided not to wonder about it too hard. Phil voted to recall her, which I thought was a fairly graceful acknowledgement on his part that the ship had sailed in a direction he did not want to be associated with. Kathy was removed from the board presidency. She remained a resident of the neighborhood, which is its own interesting social dynamic that I'll get to. Bev stepped into an interim presidency role, and she called a meeting within 2 weeks to formally restructure some of the board's processes and install some actual checks on who could issue fines and how. The police investigation wrapped up about 6 weeks after it started, and the finding was not ambiguous. Approximately $1,420 in HOA fine revenue, collected improperly in many cases to begin with, had been deposited into a personal account that Kathy controlled rather than into the HOA general fund. The investigation also turned up some documentation suggesting that a reimbursement she'd approved for herself for administrative expenses was not supported by any receipts and bore no relationship to any actual HOA expenditure. The total financial discrepancy came to just over $1,800. This is the part where the police get involved in a way that means more than just filing a report. Kathy was charged with misappropriation of funds and breach of fiduciary duty. The charges were filed on a Thursday in February, and by that Friday morning, essentially every person in Pineridge Hollow knew about it because small communities are what they are, and this was not a small piece of news. She did not come outside much after that. The legal process ran its course over the following months, and I'll give you the summary because the details are largely county courthouse paperwork. Kathy ultimately pleaded to a reduced charge, paid restitution of the full $1,800 plus back to the HOA, and received a period of supervised probation. She was also legally barred from serving on the board or handling HOA funds in any capacity going forward. Her attorney tried to frame the whole thing as a bookkeeping error, which, given that it involved a personal account, was a creative interpretation of events that the judge seemed to find unpersuasive. During all of this, the winter kept going because winter has no interest in human drama. We had 4 more plowing events between the initial fine incident and the end of March. I plowed every single one. I warmed up my truck in my driveway every single time. I drank a lot of coffee, and I watched the road come clean under my plow blade in the early morning dark, and it was fine. Better than fine, actually, because by February, warming up my truck had somehow become a minor neighborhood event. People would wave from their windows. Marco started timing his morning coffee to coincide with when he'd see my headlights on, just as a gauge of whether road conditions were serious. Dennis brought me coffee 3 more times that winter, and once brought a breakfast sandwich, which was genuinely one of the greatest things anyone has ever done for me at 6 in the morning in 8-degree weather. The HOA under Bev's interim leadership also did something that should have been done 2 winters ago. They got a proper service contract in writing, a real one with terms, a fair payment structure, and an explicit acknowledgement that my truck and its necessary warm-up time were classified as community maintenance equipment and activity. The contract included a line item for my time, not just fuel and maintenance. Bev said it was only reasonable. I didn't argue. They also started the process of getting a backup plan in place, because one person and one truck is not a resilient system. They reached out to a plowing service in town and got a quote for emergency backup coverage, which they funded by allocating a portion of the restitution money back into the reserve fund. Smart move. I'd have been glad to have backup on that 11-inch day. Plowing the same half-mile of twisting hillside road 3 times in a single day in 8-degree weather is character building, but it's a lot more character than any one person needs. By the time March turned up and the snow started actually staying melted instead of just pretending, the neighborhood had come a long way from where it had been in January. The board was functioning differently. People were more engaged. There was a general meeting in March that had good attendance not because of a crisis, but because people were genuinely interested in the new contract structure and the financial reporting system Bev had put in place, which included a quarterly statement accessible to all homeowners. Sandra had volunteered to be the financial oversight person, which seemed like the right call given that she'd been keeping her own shadow records for months anyway. The ceramic frog got a formal apology, in the sense that Patricia received a written letter from the board acknowledging that the fine had been improperly issued and including her refund check. She told me, laughing, that she'd framed the letter and hung it on the wall inside her front door. The frog was still in the garden, looking extremely unbothered by everything that had transpired. Now, I did have one more interaction with Kathy Radcliffe worth telling. It happened in late March, a gray afternoon, the kind of late winter day where the snow is half melted and everything looks tired. I was in my driveway doing some maintenance on the Plow rig, getting it sorted and cleaned up before I stored it for the season. She came walking by on the road, which she had to do because the HOA loop is a loop, and she lives on the far side of it. She had to either walk past my house or not go for walks, and she had apparently decided she was not going to surrender her walks. She stopped. I kept working. After a moment she said, "I hope you know that I always appreciated the plowing." I thought about several things I could say to that. I thought about the fine notices, the stationery, the implied threat about legal counsel, the money that had gone somewhere other than where it was supposed to go. I thought about Dennis's golden retriever Biscuit, who had come out with Dennis on one of the coffee mornings, and had sat in the snow looking extremely dignified while I scraped ice off the plow blade. I thought about the woman in labor in 2019 who'd had to wait for a four-wheel drive rescue. I said, "Thanks, Kathy," and I went back to my maintenance work. She walked on. I don't know what she was thinking, and I don't particularly need to. What I know is that Timber Creek Drive was clear and passable. The neighborhood was in better shape than it had been before any of this happened. My fine had been voided. My second fine had been voided. The service agreement was solid and fair, and spring was maybe 3 weeks out. That's a pretty good outcome for a guy who got fined for warming up his truck. There's a thing I think about sometimes when I'm out on Timber Creek Drive in the early morning, headlights cutting through the dark and snow spray flying off the blade. There's a window of time before sunrise in deep winter where the world is completely quiet and completely yours. The cold is absolute, but you're warm inside the cab. The road appears in front of you a little at a time, cleared as you go. Nobody's awake. Nobody's watching except maybe one porch light that clicks on at 5:48. I do the work because people need it done. That's the simple answer and the complete one. Timber Creek Drive needs to be passable so that a woman can get to the hospital, so a kid can get to school on time, so somebody can make a job interview they've been nervous about for 2 weeks. These things matter enormously to the people they're happening to, and whether or not a notice on official-looking stationery shows up under my wiper blade afterward is honestly a secondary concern. But I'll be honest with you. The way it played out was satisfying in a way that felt almost perfectly calibrated. Not because Kathy got in trouble. That part I would have been happy to avoid entirely if she'd just read subsection C before she started writing fine notices. But because the neighborhood came together in a way it probably hadn't in years. People who'd been silently annoyed about something or quietly worried about the financial irregularities now had a context to talk about it. The Thursday meeting in the community center, with 32 households and folding chairs running out and Sandra's inch-thick folder and Marco's phone connected to the little projector, was the kind of meeting where you can feel a community deciding to be a community again, instead of just a collection of houses that happen to share a road. Bev ran a tight ship through the rest of winter and into spring. She called a proper election in April by the actual process in the bylaws, with actual ballots administered correctly. She got elected to a full term as president, which surprised exactly nobody. Phil was replaced by a younger man named James who had apparently been watching the whole situation unfold from his window for months and had decided he wanted to be part of fixing things. Sandra joined the board in an official capacity, which meant her folder of documentation graduated from vigilante accounting to legitimate institutional record-keeping. The service contract I signed with the HOA under the new board had a 2-year term. I felt good about that. I felt good about the fuel reimbursement and the modest hourly rate for my time. I felt good about the clause that formally defined my plow vehicle as community maintenance equipment during plowing operations. I felt good about the clause that Bev had insisted on, almost shyly, which said that the board recognized and formally thanked Alex Lambert for providing continuous snow removal service to Pineridge Hollow, and that this service was considered essential to the safety and accessibility of the community. I read that clause in Bev's kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with tea she'd made and biscuit at my feet, because Dennis had brought him over and he'd wandered through the open door and decided he lived there now. And I thought about the fine notice tucked under my wiper blade in the January dark, and I thought about how strange and complete a circle that was. The plow rig is in storage now. Clean, checked, hydraulics serviced, blade treated against rust. It'll come out again in November when the first serious cold hits and I check the weather radar and look at the long-range forecast and think about what Timber Creek Drive is going to need. I'll start the truck up in my driveway in the early morning. I'll let it run until the hydraulics are warm and the engine is settled. I'll drink my coffee and check the road conditions and get my gear sorted. And if a porch light comes on across the way, I'll wave in that general direction because I'm not carrying anything about this anymore. It's over. The road is clear. The neighborhood is better. The frog is in the garden where it belongs. Everything worked out the way it was supposed to, which in my experience is not something you can always count on, but is tremendously satisfying when it happens. The people who showed up in that community center with their folding chairs and their stored-up frustrations, who signed Sandra's petition and voted and asked hard questions and demanded actual answers, they did something important. They made their neighborhood function the way a neighborhood is supposed to function, which is to say cooperatively, with people looking out for each other, and holding accountable the ones who forget that authority is supposed to serve the community and not the other way around. Kathy Radcliffe lives 2 houses down from the end of the loop. I see her occasionally. We are civil. I do not expect this to become a warm friendship, which is fine. Pineridge Hollow has 41 households and I am on good terms with about 38 of them, which is an excellent rate by any measure. The ceramic frog is still there, by the way. Patricia told me she named it. She named it Vinny, which is an excellent name for a ceramic frog who survived an HOA fine and came out on the right side of history. I asked her once that spring if she ever thought about getting a second frog. She grinned. She said she was thinking about getting 4 more. I said I thought that was the right instinct. The porch light is off. The road is clear. The season's coming. I'll be ready. That's the whole story. The morning I got fined for warming up my truck in my own driveway at dawn, I had no idea it was going to unspool into everything it became. I didn't go looking for a fight. I went looking for a road that was safe to drive, same as I do every winter, same as I'll do next winter. The rest of it, the fine notices, the meeting, Sandra's folder, the investigation, the refunds, the contracts, Vinny the frog, all of that came along because someone decided that the small power she had was big enough to override common sense, and she was wrong about that in a way that turned out to matter quite a bit. Be good to your neighbors. Do the work. Know your bylaws. And for the love of everything, warm up your truck. It's cold out there.